Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Cases. I'm Shant Kerbabian. Freedom of press media is the freedom of communication and expression through mediums, including various electronic media and published materials. While such freedom mostly implies that absence of interference from an overreaching state, its preservation may be sought through constitutional or other legal protections. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers." Lebanon is not only a regional center of media production, but it is also considered the most liberal and free in the Arab world. Now, according to Reporters Without Borders, the media have more freedom in Lebanon than in other Arab countries. Despite its small population and geographic size, Lebanon plays a significant role in the production of information in the Arab world and is the core of a regional media network with global implications. But despite Lebanon's acclaimed freedom of press, and according to the 2014 World Press Freedom Index compiled by also Reporters Without Borders, Lebanon was ranked 106th among 180 nations surveyed. And with various reports of journalists being under scrutiny and sometimes physically attacked, bloggers and netizens being detained and jailed, one has to wonder, how free is press in Lebanon? Now, joining us today to discuss the issue of freedom of press in the Middle East, and Lebanon in particular, is our guest in the studio, Mr. Mohammed, Kleit, researcher and journalist. And also joining us via satellite from Beirut is Mr. Atallah Al-Salim, researcher and blogger. Welcome, gentlemen. Now, before we get to our discussion, we have a small video about the idea of freedom of speech and press. Let's check it out.
Imagine a world in which there is no right to inform, report, investigate, challenge, or express an opinion. Picture this world in which there is no freedom of expression and barely anyone left to defend it. This is a world where men and women are exiled from their homes and declared enemies of the very states to which their lives were dedicated to building. A world where corruption touches the very powers meant to protect. A world in which your voice goes unheard, your views are rejected, and your interests ignored. A world where those who defend the truth, publish facts, and speak out against tyranny are targeted, imprisoned, tortured, and left to rot in silence, where self-censorship becomes the only rule. This is a world that readily condemns an independent press as a plague to be eradicated. For over 5.5 billion people, this is the reality of their world today. You only know this because you're part of the fortunate 17% of the human race who enjoy unrestricted freedom of expression. This knowledge is power. Use it to help us make a difference. The conviction that free and independent newspapers play an indispensable role in maintaining free societies and guaranteeing human rights has been at the heart of this organization for over 60 years. A free press is at the very core of the right to free expression, providing a frontline defense when it comes to safeguarding access to knowledge and information as defined in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A free press provides a window through which all the abuses of this most fundamental of rights can be revealed. Put simply, freedom of expression is the right that underpins all rights. Media employees around the world face physical violence and persecution of all kinds, whether from public officials, criminals, or terrorists. Assaults are daily and often deadly for those who challenge governments, report on conflict, or investigate corruption and crime. These people are the courageous publishers, editors, and journalists who continue, in the face of repression, to deliver the news and inform the public of their right to know. Join us in making press freedom a reality for everyone.
Very inspirational video, Mr. Mohammed. And the video starts with, imagine a world without freedom of speech. Now, can we do that?
Well, we can't say that it's not working lately, because as you see, most governments are oppressing journalists or bloggers or activists who are pro freedom of speech, who are anti their governments, who like to expose the corruption of their governments. You can say here in Lebanon or in the lands of the free in the USA.
It's happening everywhere.
Exactly.
It's happening everywhere. There's this misconception that certain areas are more prone
you can criticize the enemy. You can criticize your rivals, your enemies, but you can't criticize your allies. You can't criticize the military. And you can't criticize your government, because by that you're either threatening the national security, or it's for the general security of the country.
Absolutely true. Egypt, Syria,
exactly.
Just you name it. It's everywhere.
True.
But when we say freedom of speech, what do we mean by this idea? I mean, like, this idea is prone to many interpretations. But can you give us your own view of this term, freedom of speech?
Well, it depends on the ideology and the culture of a nation or of the crowd as a whole. I mean, in the Arab world, you've got the notion of the freedom of speech is related to also responsibility. Sadly, that's in an abstract form, but on the ground, it's a different case. In the abstract form, in the Arab culture, you have the freedom to say whatever you want. You have the freedom to express in whatever way you want. But there's a responsibility that you have to respect others' freedom, and as former Prime Minister of Lebanon has said, as Dr. Salim al-Hos, that your freedom is bounded by others' freedom, which indicates the responsibility that everyone has in their freedom while practicing it. But on the ground, you see, it's a different case. Yes, we do say that we have the freedom of the press, and we can tackle any news item that we want, but we cannot go in depth in any of those items. We cannot expose corruption. We cannot talk about religious figures. We can't, even if they were wrong. I'm not saying we can talk about religious figures in any way possible or criticizing them in any way possible. No. I mean, a person can be an atheist, but he should respect any religious figure of any religion whatsoever. But the point is that when criticism comes in a way, in a constructive way, then it's a healthy community that you're living in.
I would like to note, just small statistic, that 70% of Americans agree with the notion of that freedom of speech is sacred, even if it's offensive sometimes to others. But freedom of speech is like, it's the First Amendment. There's always the argument, it's the First Amendment. Do you agree with this notion?
No, not at all, because if someone was an extremist in his freedom, well, he's abusing his freedom of speech, then he's not respecting the beliefs of others, he's not respecting other ideologies or the other opinion. Then it's sort of like another dictatorship, but it's working on the level of the community, not only the level of the authority.
Allow me now to go to our guest via satellite from Beirut, Mr. Atallah. Mr. Atallah, in the video there was the idea or the notion that freedom of expression or freedom of speech it underpins the other rights, the other human rights that are out there. Do you agree with this notion? Do you agree that human of expression, human of speech, and also which is intertwined, freedom of press, is a crucial right in society and for humans?
Yeah, definitely, because it's like a component of human dignity. You cannot give the right for people for self-determination, for example, unless they have the right to speak out loudly about their rights, about their freedoms, and express their opinions in a very expressive and democratic manner.
But when this is very theoretical talk. But let's try to look on things on ground around the world. I mean, do you think things are going really well when it comes to freedom of speech on ground. And I'm not talking about Lebanon right now. We are going to focus on Lebanon in the second segment. But let's just take a look around in general. And we see situations horrific. What is your comment on that?
Well, for the past, it was the issue of censorship had been globally received an attention from the governments and from the ruling elites. I don't think this was during the 19th and early 20th century when the political and the religious institutions were powerful in shaping or influencing the daily lives of citizens. Now that the people around the globe revolted, now that we had a tremendous change in the values and the democratic values and norms around the globe, I don't think there's a place to combat or to fight people's freedoms. This is what concerns the world. However, especially these days amid what's happening, what the so-called Arab Spring, I don't think there's a chance or possibility from any political elite anymore to violate this right, this essential human right.
But what was the effect the Arab Spring had on this notion specifically, on the notion of freedom of expression or freedom of press?
If you look at the case of Egypt, for example, there was too many activists during the past 6 or 7 years, starting in 2006, 2007, blogging about certain acts or misbehavior or misconduct from the internal security forces there, and I think this culminated in a protests throughout the 2010 and 2011. Rabab Abdel Mahdi was one of those young activists that spoke about this and blogged about what the ISF in Egypt were doing, which were against human dignity, and they were exposing people to physical assault and verbal assault as well. So I believe that the internet activism, which was taking place or which was booming in the mid-1990s and the 2000s, had impacted a lot the status of freedom of press.
Let's talk about since you brought up the idea of internet activism, and also like anyone nowadays is a journalist, and especially with social media,
with the citizen journalism
exactly
notions, yeah.
Citizen journalism out there. Everyone is a journalist, and everyone, like, you take a photo and you post it out there, and this was something that was used heavily during the Arab Spring. Do you think the governments were not ready for this kind of tactic that was used by activists, and they were taken
precisely? I think they underestimated this factor. And while they were busy putting restrictions on laws and regulations, political parties, syndicates, and trade unions, there was an underground activism movement flourishing between on the internet, and the blogging activity of the Arab people had started to take its path, regardless or despite government or at a point or at a time when governments were not attentive to this.
Allow me now, Mr. Mohammed, we're talking, this is a very important idea, the idea of blogging and the bloggers and the activism that was somehow being cooked underground, as Mr. Atallah said, and the governments were not paying attention to this factor, but suddenly it was this magnificent weapon that was out there. And do you think that at one point some people used this to manipulate the activists or the revolutions around, especially in the Middle East, to use it for their own political gains?
Well, after they realized the power of this tool, that because certain crowds in certain nations, such as Egypt, after the Mubarak regime, or during the Mubarak regime, also during the revolution at the same time, or you can see people during under the reign of the Khaliji emirs and kings, in such rules, blogging has become a very vital element for the crowd that opposed their government. But at the same time, after these governments have realized the power of blogging or citizen activism, or citizen journalism, they have also used this as, we say here in Lebanon, the fifth crowd in war terms. They use it in order to manipulate these crowds, to direct them towards the things that they want, even if not directly towards liking the authority, but they also used it in order to show, well, you have this is the alternative that you're looking after, look how bad it is. In another way, they would see that the first, like now that what happened in Egypt, like they've seen the after Morsi reign. Now they're saying we wish Mubarak had never left. So the Islamic Brotherhood has been the pro-Sisi crowd is using this in order to make people hate Morsi more and more, or the Islamic Brotherhood more and more, in order to make them more fond of Sisi. But unfortunately, not all of the crowd has understood that, and most of them have went towards the Mubarak reign again. Now the Egyptian people is stuck between three options.
But where does the press come here? Where does the blogging come here?
Okay, blogging comes here because one of the people, the blogger is a part of the crowd, of this crowd, is one of the people, and he's showing his opinion of what he's seeing. So people take this person more credible than any other mainstream media, because mainstream media is in the hands of the government or wealthy businessmen who are in favor of the government or have their own agendas. Unlike bloggers who have their own thoughts, it's part of the crowd. And
it's the chain effect, it's the chain reaction,
exactly.
Which is beautiful. Allow me now to stop here, gentlemen. We'll take our first break, and we'll be right back. After the break, we'll focus on the situation of press in Lebanon. Stay tuned.
Beyond the lines, beyond the surface. Depth, clarity, substance. Beyond the discourse.
Beyond politics, beyond the shallowness of everyday politics.
The crisis of capitalism, the European impasse, the energy shortages, the emerging power of Asia, the economic power of the Arab world, the economic debate, informative, revealing, and progressive. It discusses the economic event of the world.
Economic debate, where the numbers reveal the truth.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Before we focus on the situation in Lebanon, we have this report about the situation of press in Lebanon and the freedom of press. Let's check it out.
While the freedom of media in Lebanon has long been celebrated as an oasis within the Middle East, the political environment and repression may represent a challenge to that reputation. The internet, as well as newspapers, is increasingly becoming a contested space in the country, long offering a gray area of legal jurisdiction, as well as a platform where sectarianism, political connection, and corruption exercise judgment through self-censorship. It may now face a more constrained future, restricted by the same political sectarian divisions which impose such a stranglehold on the country. While a new law regarding the internet is yet to be implemented, reports of low-profile arrests and intimidations targeting online activists continue to attract attention. Moving to Lebanese TV stations on November 2013, the security forces arrested 4 television journalists who were beaten and had their equipment smashed in downtown Beirut for protesting outside the office of the Lebanese Customs after being refused entry. Lebanese customs agents called for a one-day strike on Wednesday after the beating of journalists by the security forces outside the customs office sparked protests. The most recent case was on March 3 when the Lebanese Justice Minister Ashraf Rifi took action against the journalist Brahim Al-Amin from Al-Akhbar newspaper, for writing a column that criticized President Michel Suleiman earlier that day. The Justice Minister referred the article entitled Lebanon Without a President to the appellate prosecution to take the necessary measures against its writer, who was accused of libel, and the Daily, which published it. According to the 2014 World Press Freedom Index compiled by Reporters Without Borders, Lebanon was ranked 106 among the 180 nations surveyed. Amid all the attacks on journalists, what would the future of freedom of press in Lebanon look like?
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Mohammed, this is the hot topic now. This is about Lebanon, and let's get right to it. I mean, Lebanon is known, especially in the Arab world, that is the free oasis, especially when it comes to freedom of speech and press. But how true is that? How free press is in Lebanon?
No, actually, if you want to say it's a free compared to other Arab nations, it's one of the best models in the Arab nations, because Lebanon is the only, I think it's the only country in the Arab world that has two opinions. You have the pro-government and the anti-government.
It's not two, it's actually 5, 6, 7 opinions you might have, because
in a general way, it's either you're pro-8 or you're pro-14. The ones who are in the middle, exactly.
The two major coalitions or the parties in the country, yeah.
The ones who are in the middle are kind of lenient towards towards the 14 and the 8. Unlike you find it in the Gulf, it's an easy example. They're all most of them are all pro-government, except the activists that you have. And
you can't, especially in the Gulf countries, you can't be a journalist or press or press or an activist and be against the government.
Exactly. In Iraq, you have a different case, because in Iraq, it's sort of a special case, because it's either you're pro-Iranian or you're pro-Khaliji.
So there's also the divide.
There's also the divide in that. It depends on what's the media outlet aiming for.
Okay, but the case of Lebanon is special because of what? What made Lebanon become or turn into this model in the Arab world?
It's the practice although lately the practices of journalism has been aiming towards an extremist form. It's either you have a certain problem in the country. You're either with the problem or against it, or you're with the person that's causing the problem or against him. And you take a very extreme form, whether in political programs, whether in normal news broadcasts, or even in newspapers or magazines. So if a person wants to really wants to know the whole idea behind the subject, you just have to follow both of the opinions. Then you have a clear view of the topic. But the problem is, in Lebanon, most of the crowd, so we won't generalize in this, they don't follow that. They take the easy way out. You just follow one opinion and stick to that opinion. And as the first report has mentioned, that only 17% are aware of the two opinions, while the rest are not. And I think this is also applicable here in Lebanon. If the entire Lebanese population is aware of this two-opinion divide, and they read both of these opinions, they would create the sort of objective view, because objectivity in the end is an abstract term. They would have this sort of objective view of the problem or the issue. Then they would know the right path or the right decision that they would take.
But then again, nobody wants to know the right path, because things are tending towards extreme mobilization in the whole region, and specifically, since we're talking about Lebanon.
And then partial truth can also lead to several problems, because imagine if you're living a life for several decades, and in the end the truth turns out to be a totally different fact. That would spark a whole chaos.
You go through shock and trauma, and that's it. Allow me now to go to our guest, Mr. Atallah. Mr. Atallah, we're talking about the press in Lebanon and freedom of press in Lebanon. I was reading an article a couple of days ago, and the title was very interesting. The title was "The Myth of Freedom of Press in Lebanon." But I'm not going to go into the details, but do you agree with the title of this article, that the freedom of press that we have, like I asked the question earlier also, I would like to have your opinion, it's a myth?
Yes, to a certain extent, because ever since its creation, Lebanon had been historically known for being the heaven of freedom of press, or the center point between the East and West. And given its location, it had benefited from the fact that authoritarian regimes had took the lead or the political control all over the territory. So that's why Beirut at that time had witnessed a very good publishing record with all the books, novels, stories, and newspapers published from here in Lebanon. But I think the reality now is way different. Because as media reports had, as you mentioned in the report, there's too much restrictions. Even though this is not done purposefully, this is done sometimes in an indirect way. But I think violations toward the freedom of toward press is really increasing over the past few years. For example, there was that called there's a certain department or branch from the ISF called the IT-related crimes, which had been active in arresting bloggers and activists for some kind of articles or reports, especially one touching on politicians' behavior or conduct, or even criticizing their policies under the title of naming and
even public figures as well.
Yeah, even public figures. This wasn't before. And what is more ironical is that at a time when the country is said to be free from any foreign intervention, because as you know, the Syrians had withdrawn their troops in 2005, and the main argument back that time was that the Syrians, along with a certain political elites, had manipulated the media scene.
So this was like the promised freedom that everyone was like about to witness. But what happened?
What happened is exactly the opposite. It turned out to be that, we have such an outdated media law, which still classifies the media as the magazine or the newspaper, everything that is readable, there's negotiations done at within the parliamentary committees to either include the new media tools within this 1963 media law, or to have a new law on the social media regulations.
But as you mentioned, and as we talked about earlier, like social media and the tools that it introduced, again, the governments weren't ready to absorb the form of change that it produced. But what do you think steps have to be taken by the government when it comes to social media, when it comes to this form of press that is being used by citizens? What has to be done?
I don't think there's a necessity to impose any kind of restrictions. As I mentioned, the blogs and websites are not considered as a media outlet up to the moment in Lebanon. On the contrary, the government should encourage people, especially the young generation, to express themselves, and should teach them to express themselves in a very democratic and out loud manner without being offensive. And this brings us to a new discussion over here, which is the role of educational institutions and raising people's awareness on media ethics, media laws, and how to express ourselves in a very open, transparent, but democratic manner.
But what is the problem with expressing yourself? Why do politicians have this tendency of creating problems every time a law that is being prepared, or every time people are asking for more freedom of press, or for more freedom of, for example, net press or internet freedoms?
Let me mention this from my own experience. I've been a project coordinator and advocating for the passage of the Access to Information Law, which has passed now to the parliamentary committees, and a number of MPs had managed to submit this draft law in 2009 to the parliament. Okay, without granting access to information, I think the most people, or the most group of society members who would benefit from the passage of this law is the media people, or the reporters in general, because when the government release or publish timely reports, updated reports, and some kind of official census or data from its public administrations and governorates, then it would be much easier for the journalist to rely on the report rather than relying on his personal connections or some kind of political figures that he managed to be close to.
Mr. Mohammed, what is the reason of the recent offenses that we're seeing towards journalists, towards bloggers, towards like some people were detained because of certain tweets on Twitter, some people were detained because of certain statuses on Facebook, and what's happening?
Well, in that case, you have to differentiate between, because there are two categories. If you're talking about libel and slander, as the government or Ashraf Rifi has mentioned it towards journalist Ibrahim Al-Amin, or also towards Rabia Farran or Mohammed Nazzal, which everyone has a different case, but all undergo
but it's all related.
the same.
It goes under the freedom
the same
of
title,
expression.
exactly. And you've got the social activists, social media, where the young man who was in prison for 2 months because of criticizing the president. Although I do not agree with what he has written, I'm with criticizing people in a constructive way, even if they were the president.
But it doesn't mean you should detain the guy.
Exactly, but the way he said it, it was a bit extreme, where it was also unorthodox to cuss the president in such a way. If he was criticizing, I mean, I personally criticize the president, but I don't criticize him as a person.
I mean, you disagree with the manner.
Exactly, but I do not accept any person that is cussing people out loud in a very public way. While as in journalism, in the journalist part, such as Rabia Farran and the others, well, that has proven, in accordance to the Lebanese law, is an illegal way to detain people or journalists in specific, because every newspaper has, and this was written in 1974 and published on Nahar newspaper on the 25th and on the 25th of February. It was published on Nahar newspaper that the fifth amendment that was placed was every news outlet has the right to criticize the roles of any political figure or any company or any person that has to do with the Lebanese community in a constructive way, but they are not allowed to go under the title of libel and slander. So when Ibrahim Al-Amin has written that article against the president, he was criticizing his role and his speeches that were lately have been a bit more extreme, and he was not.
He didn't attack him personally.
Exactly, he was not attacking. He was attacking the role that the president.
Like he was criticizing the role that the president was playing in certain political accidents or even internal things in the country.
As well as the case of Rabia Farran, who was criticizing Layla Abdul Latif. He was not criticizing her as a person, of her attitude or her actions. He was criticizing her of what she's doing towards the society, of her role as a job, and in the way that she's affecting the society in a very bad way. That was constructive criticism. But because of her political contacts, she was able to have 2 cases against him. Also in the case of Ibrahim Amin. While Mohammed Nazzal, this was probably the awkwardest case in Lebanese history, that he was able to get fresh data and facts against a judge that was helping drug dealers get out of jail easily, and the court accepted the facts and they found that they were valid. But at the same time, they detained Mohammed Nazzal and they punished him. So this was, how would you say it, that it was one of the most awkwardest cases that we have ever seen here in Lebanon against journalists.
But since we're talking about the journalists and since we're talking about the media, I would like to talk about the media outlets. I mean, what's puzzling is the freedom of press, and you're free, but with certain limits. I mean, it depends on.
You cannot attack the president, the commander, the army commander in chief, and I think we missed talking about the religious institutions,
Religious figures,
because
exactly.
religious institutions are believed to have a very influential impact on the political figures as well, on the public figures.
Well,
especially with the censorship issue, for example,
Mr.
and
Atallah,
the
my
influence
next-
on the general security.
My next question was going to be about this precisely, exactly. Well, thank you. Well, which was this? Like, I mean, you are in media and you're in these outlets, but you can criticize certain things, but as long as you don't go towards the religious institutions. And I'm not saying attacking personally religious figures, but I'm saying criticizing certain laws, criticizing certain things that are like the pressure that religious institutions have on the society, on the community, on media, but you're not allowed to pressure that. How deep is this problem? I mean, I would like to have your answer
This
first. Mr.
has
Mohammed.
also, this goes back also to a social, to a societal norm that we're living in Eastern cultures. I mean, religion has a very strong role in all of the Arab worlds, especially here in Lebanon, since also we have many religions, we have many sects as well. So we cannot erase the power of religion of the face of Lebanon, also, and their influence also on the press.
Allow me, Mohammed, to interrupt you. Atallah, I will have your comment on this issue also, but after the break, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned, please.
Time. Variable. Event. The only constant variable in life is change. Broader perspective. Arguments and counter-arguments on our platform.
Global Insights. The globe on our platform.
Pollution and climate change. Medicine manipulation. Genetically modified food. The destruction of wildlife and corporate exploitation. These are all part of a new terrorism threatening our future.
Eco-terrorism. Global awakening to a world under threat.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now, before we go to our third segment, which is the bullet point segment, we're going to have the comments about the role the religious or the pressure the religious institutions have. Mr. Mohammed, I would like you to continue your point, and then I'm going to have Mr. Atallah's opinion as well.
As I mentioned in the previous segment, that in the Eastern cultures, religion has a very strong influence on the authority and as well as journalism, since journalism is partially part of this authority. So, in Lebanon, it's a special case because of the diversity of religions and sects. So, if we have this freedom without responsibility to criticize religions, as we see on, especially on comedy programs, that they criticize them in a very hysterical manner, in a very demeaning manner. So this will cause problems, as we have seen in many cases. But if there is a responsible freedom where we can criticize the religious figures' acts, especially not the religion as a whole, but as the acts of these persons, that whether it's in corruption and bribery and so on, then we would also build this constructive, we would build this good society in a constructive manner.
Okay. So, Mohammed, allow me now to have Mr. Atallah's comments on this. Mr. Atallah, can you quickly comment on the notion that we were discussing, which was the effect or the pressure that religious institutions and figures have on freedom of speech and freedom of press, on the press in general?
Sure. Let me please touch on or highlight two cases which explains or shows how much the religious institutions is influential in influencing or making more censorship. One, there was that case about that clergyman or the priest who exercised sexual abuse toward their child, and this was totally silenced and this case was never brought up or totally silenced by all media outlets. This is one. Number two, religious institutions back then in 2012, I guess, had pressured the general security to cut off some scenes of the Lebanese movie Tannura Maxi because some scenes were somehow sensitive to Christianity or to Christian religion. So I guess these two cases says a lot about the role or the impact that the religious institutions have on the media circles and the political figures as well.
Okay.
And if I could add also one thing, there's also the novel of the Da Vinci Code for Dan Brown.
Yeah, sure.
It was also later on I think after 2 years after it was published, it was also censored in Lebanon, although the movie was out, and I've read also the book.
I mean, the issue of censorship in Lebanon is like an issue that we can have a whole full episode about, because there are a lot of cases that could be discussed. But allow me now, gentlemen, to go to our segment of bullet points where we show and discuss certain bullet points, and I have your comments on them. I'll start with the first one, which is things that affect the freedom of speech and freedom of expression and press. First of all, the political censors. Now, general political parameters that crimp journalists' style and modus operandi security. Mr. Mohammed, we have the first issue, which affects the freedom of press, which is political censors. How effective or how badly political censors affect freedom of press?
This also comes along with the self-censorship that journalists have. Self-censorship in a sense that there's a certain case or issue that's happening in the country, that's a journalist that's working on, so that when he's writing his article or working on his report, there's this sense of self-censorship that he has to have in order not to divert the community towards chaos or so on. And
that's
as well
more ethical,
this is the ethical part of journalism. But then again, when this issue that the journalist is reporting on would cause a problem to a certain political figure or to a political team, then this political team will make this pressure on this journalist or the news outlet in order to place the censorship on certain parts, if not the report as a whole.
Okay. Now, allow me now to go to the second bullet point, which is the security apparatus censors. Now, using national security as a cover to terrorize reporters. Now, Mr. Atallah, you commented on this point earlier, so I would like you to have your comment on this. When you use the security or national security or like the fear of the state or the country crumbling to censor or even sometimes even stop press, or like, for example, in Turkey, we were discussing with Mr. Mohammed earlier, Prime Minister Erdogan was considering or even thinking about blocking YouTube and Facebook, and earlier they blocked Twitter because it was fear of national security. How bad this problem is?
Well, I think this problem is more into our Arab region, because it has been historically the authoritarian regimes which took place or which held in the 1960s and 1970s had exercised too much of the security or had took advantage over this cause or this argument to silence reporters, journalists and activists. And I think that the security apparatus is feared, and this is why the Arab people in general or the Arab population had always manifested some kind of fear toward the security apparatus, because the security apparatus is very large and has so many powers in its hands. For example, the case of Tunisia, the ones working for the intelligence and the internal forces were 3 times more than the army members, which reveals a lot about the security having a very powerful role over the political scene.
Okay, now allow me now to go to the third bullet point here, which is the ruling regime's censors. Now, fear of the ruler's fear for his fate. Now, this is a very obvious case. This is happening especially almost everywhere. But like, since we're talking about the region, the MENA region, it happened in Libya, it happened in Tunisia, it happened
it's still happening in Syria, it's happening in Bahrain,
it's happening in Egypt, in Bahrain, and probably many other countries in the future. But do you think this is a factor that could last for a long time?
Well, yeah, of course. In the end, it's even with, after we hope that this so-called Arab Spring that will bring new hopes for the people, that especially us journalists, that will bring more freedom to press in several countries. And I would also take Egypt as an example for this. And the memorial of the 25th of October, the 10th of October revolution. The 25th of October revolution. The prominent protesters in the first revolution against Mubarak went to protest in front of the syndicacy of journalism in Egypt. Even bloggers started blogging against Sisi and against Morsi at the same time, and those people were censored. And even the protesters that were protesting in front of the syndicacy were all detained to jail as well for protesting against Sisi and against Morsi as well.
Okay, so this is one of the most dangerous things that could affect freedom of speech and freedom of press in any country, specifically in the region. Now let's move on to the next point, which is the controlling party censors. Now, pressures leading to chill reading in the media for the ruling regime or a trade union. Mr. Atallah, I would like to have your comment on this issue. When you have the ruling party, especially, and let's focus on Lebanon, for example, where every party has its own media outlet, and each media is playing the role of a chill reader for this media, for this party. Now, can I have your comment on this censorship in this case?
In this case, for example, the media outlet would be selective in choosing, for example, if we have a pro-government media outlet, it would be they will be very sensitive or hesitant to publish any kind of corruption case or which is related to the government. So they would shed light more on the anti-government corruption, even though certain corruption might be done by public figures who are part of the ruling regime or the ruling authority.
But you get choosy. You just choose what to focus on. You choose what to highlight on.
Yeah, definitely. And this is the case of Lebanon.
Exactly. Now, the last bullet point that we would like to focus on, which was something we talked about earlier, is religious censorship. Religious institutions often ask government authorities to censor that which they feel diverges from their doctrines, and the government often obliges. I'd like to have your comment, Mr. Mohammed, and also Mr. Atallah's short comments, because we have 2 minutes to end. So, Mr. Mohammed.
This happens in either two cases. If the religious authorities are corrupt, then they're protecting their corruption. Or if it's a truly religious authority that only wants its authority to be respected, or if that's only the case if it was a fair and just authority, then the sort of demeaning of this authority, it would use its power to pressure whether the media outlets or the politicians in order to censor the part of report or program or whatever it is.
Okay, Mr. Atallah, can I have your comment in a minute, please, about this?
Well, the political system over here, as you know, is highly sectarian one, where the sectarian political figures gain legitimacy or receive legitimacy from their religious clerics or religious institutions. So there's always an interlink between religious institutions and the political figures, and this is leading to some kind of censorship and limitation for freedoms or for press freedoms or even other rights or other freedoms.
Mr. Atallah, Al-Salim, I would like to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
And Mr. Mohammed Kleit, also thank you very much for being part of Cases. Ladies and gentlemen, this was our case for tonight. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, which is a sacred, and everyone should fight for it. See you next week with a different case. Take care, bye-bye.